Right, afternoon everyone. So we're here to talk about Dracula and late Victorian culture in general. Take some notes, but I'll also be recording this, okay? Have a quick look at these questions at the moment now. We won't take any time to do them, but make sure that you can answer them. Firstly, how many stages should there be in an unseen response? What is an oxymoron and why is it such an effective literary device? And finally, why does the figure of the vampire continue to excite and interest us so much? And I'm thinking about Eclipse, Twilight, True Blood, and the huge plethora of versions of the vampire genre. Quickly make sure with your partner that you can answer these questions. Okay, guys. I know I've been quick, but we'll have a little talk, okay? How many stages, Kaylee, in an unseen prose response? 3 that we've talked about ideally. Is it okay to do 2?
Yeah, as long as it's detailed.
Yes, as long as they're detailed, and we want to show a sense of an argument. Why do we want to do that, Matt?
Because it just shows that sort of progress through the thing, excitement.
So there's got to be 2 sides. So, you know, in American terms, you've got to have thesis and antithesis, okay? Yes, it is, you know, such and such for this reason, and no, it isn't. And then some kind of synthesis at the end, isn't there, where we bring those 2 together and look at them and come out on either side or say, actually, it's impossible to tell, okay? Harrison, an oxymoron or an oxymoron, as I like to say, what is it? Why do you think it's effective to use it in poetry in particular, if I said sort of bittersweet or loving hate? Anyone else? Mox, why do you think an oxymoron is often used?
Contrast something that has sort of relevance to each other.
Do you think it's because, especially in Western thought, we tend to think in opposites? When you put opposites together and somehow they work, it's a bit weird, isn't it? It's basically what we call a paradox, isn't it, yeah? Paradox means it doesn't seem to make sense, but somehow it does. Now that is a literary device that makes you think very carefully about something. Romeo very famously says, "Oh, loving hate." You know, why do you think he said that, Matthew?
Because he's really in a confused state, doesn't know what his emotions are.
Okay, so it brilliantly illustrates his conflicted emotions and how he's in an impossible catch-22 situation. Yeah? Great answer, yeah? Right, Lois, tell me about the vampire. Why do we love the vampire sucking our blood so much? Why do we get all excited? Do you like the vampire genre? Okay, then you're the worst person to answer the question. Whereas Catherine likes the vampire genre.
But like, the excitement with that whole vampire stuff is because it's dead. And they're dead, you know what I mean? And people don't know what death is like.
Absolutely. It's about 2 things, actually, or maybe even 3. It's about death and sex, because the vampire genre is very sexy, isn't it? And you only have to watch Twilight to see that the vampire has become a kind of sexy cult hero now, hasn't he? Yeah. Along with the werewolf, we had a discussion with the other group about who's more attractive, the werewolf or the vampire.
Edward.
Okay.
I've not watched this yet. Tyler Lautner or Ron Patterson.
Interesting enough, what we were talking about now is the fact that Dracula and the vampire figure has moved from being like an old man to a very attractive teenage idea, isn't it? And the vampire genre has actually become a kind of teen genre, isn't it? You notice that? And I think that began with the generation after me, that's the generation in between us, with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Has anyone seen that?
Yeah.
Which was a sort of teen American program in which Buffy is, as the title indicates, a vampire slayer up against vampires. And the interesting thing is the vampires were invariably like good-looking, sexy, kind of football-playing boys. And you didn't know they were vampires. And she obviously goes and executes and kills them. Okay. So vampire, very popular. We like the vampire, don't we? Very exciting. Probably more vampire stories now than ever before. Why is it? Still got to get our finger on it, isn't it? What do you think, Tia? Do you like a little vampire yarn? What is it about the vampire?
It's like a fantasy.
So there's a fantasy element in it. What we talked about before as well is as men are not allowed to be masculine anymore, in many ways, compared to what they used to be, it's quite interesting that the fantasy man becomes a vampire, a raging animal, etc. And that becomes a figure of the romance genre. So when you actually look at the original Dracula that we're going to study today, it's got absolutely nothing to do with romance. No one is turned on by Count Dracula. He's just a vicious, horrible animal. But today we've moved it into the romance genre. Why have we done that, do you think?
I think because there's a sort of mystery around the person. I think that's sort of creative.
So we've gone from being hostile to the vampire figure to being interested, okay, and actually seeing the vampire as a kind of hero. Often I think, like Edward, as a nonconformist. As someone who's more interesting than the average dull member of the hoi polloi. You know what I mean? All right, so all interesting stuff. Vampire is one of my favourites. And today, as I said, we're going to give you lots of AO3, late Victorian stuff. We're going to learn a lot of new language today, a lot of new terms. We're going to focus a lot on evolution. We're going to focus a lot on something called degeneration. And I'm going to tell you all about that. And then we're going to think about how we will contextualize this information and put it into our essays, because we need to integrate it. This is not history, is it? First, it's literary analysis, and history always follows. And we're also then going to do a three-stage, in the second lesson, a three-stage plan for an answer on a passage, on an amazing passage, in which Jonathan Harker has his blood sucked by three incredibly gorgeous vampire girls. Wonderful scene. Right, who am I going to tell you about? The original author of Dracula is Bram Stoker, an Irishman. So it's written in 1897, the turn of the century, okay? Very important because the end of the Victorian age, like I told you before, is an age of unease. Some of you would know the end of the 20th century was also an age of unease. There was a stock market crash. We were told Y2K, all the computers were going to break. Loads of people in America stockpiled food and got loads of guns like they always do in case the Mexicans came over the border. And there was a general sense that we were like being threatened. And this seems to be a pattern in history, that the end of a century is often seen as a kind of a terrifying time, okay? Now in the novel concerns an Englishman called Jonathan Harker, who is a lawyer, and it concerns him and his fiancée, Mina, who travel to Transylvania. Count Dracula is an aristocrat. Transylvania is in the middle of Europe in the Carpathian Mountains. And Count Dracula himself is based on a real historical figure. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. His name was Vlad the Impaler, or Count Dracula. He was not the best friend to Muslim people, I'm afraid, Moch. He liked to spear them and put them on his wall, and that's why he was called Vlad the Impaler. He insisted at every meal that he had at least one person dying on a spear on his wall. Good. I'm not necessarily saying you are. I thought you might be interested in this little historical tidbit. So he was a great Christian warrior, crusader type hero. But he was also, of course, incredibly brutal to his own people. So the key thing that Bram Stoker did is he went throughout that area in Europe. He found out all of the myths about vampires. Tell me some now. If a vampire comes to your window, how do you repulse him? Garlic? Garlic? No, it's definitely garlic. It's not shallots. Holy water's good. Cross, the crucifix, you could burn it. If you invite them in, you're screwed. Okay, so they can't. Yeah, they can't. Yes, you can't see them in a mirror. Yeah, they burn in daylight, as we've seen in True Blood. If any of you have watched Eric burns to death, he gets a bit of sunburn. And they command which animals?
Bats.
Woo! They turn into bats, don't they? Yes, they do.
But bats are like.
What do they do? What do they do in the day? Yes, in a coffin. They have to sleep in a coffin. That's right. Yeah, so that's when they're very vulnerable. And to kill them, straight through the heart and rip off their head and fill their mouth with garlic. Okay. So all of this stuff is very interesting, and Bram Stoker didn't make it up. He actually went round and he found out all of these different myths, and he combined them into his book, together with real-life history of Vlad the Impaler. So he chose Transylvania because it's a very blood-drenched kind of area with a very cruel history, etc. Okay? All very interesting. Just to remind you, whenever we do unseen prose, this is the bit I'm talking about today. You will notice we've got 24% on the AO3. And that's why now it's my job in the next few months to make sure that you go in with enough historical knowledge so that you can tack it into the passage. But just to remind you, you don't put loads of padding, you don't put whole separate paragraphs about history. It must come out of the passage, okay? So that's our focus for today. That's our biggest learning objective for today. How are we going to take all this information I give you, and how are we then going to integrate it into our analysis? Because we're not in a history lesson, no. Okay. Remember what I said? Simple arguments don't score highly. I prefer three-stage argument, okay, so that you have three different stages. Tia?
When you do the comparison essay on God's symptom, how, like, at the end, we're supposed to make a link. Like, are you linking anywhere because you're between two novels, or do you have to link between two novels?
You tend to make a link at the end of each paragraph. In the unseen, AO4, the linking will come with one other text. And so today, we will be linking with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, for instance, okay? So your AO4. AO4, you'll notice, is not quite so important here in this one. It's only 12%. AO4 and AO5, they're not so important, okay? But they still need to be done, don't they? It's only 3 marks out of 25 for each of those, okay? Right, so AO1 is always king. Why do I say that? And it drives everything. So in other words, you plan the structure of your argument first. If you don't plan, you're screwed, guys. You only need to write for 30 minutes. Remember what I said? Reading, annotating, 10 minutes of planning is essential if you're going to do well on this question. Okay, I'm not going to go into this too much now. This is the extract we're going to look at, and I'll go and get copies for it in a minute. We are going to look at this extract I told you, where Jonathan Harker is surrounded by these 3 gorgeous vampire girls. Dream on that, Harrison? How good would that be? Okay. The only problem is that they do drink your blood and leave you very weakened afterwards. Okay. So there is Jonathan Harker, and as you will see in the extract, he's kind of terrified by them, but he kind of enjoys it as well. So I'm going to be telling you about all the dark, naughty, weird kind of Victorian history that will make this passage really interesting. Okay, let me tell you a little bit, okay. Here's where you need to take some notes. Firstly, remind yourself, the angel in the house. This is the prevailing Victorian ideology for women. It is the most important piece of gender history for you to know. It comes from a poem by a poet called Coventry Patmore, and it becomes a kind of catchphrase for Victorian. Obviously, the idea of the angel is that women are spiritually better than men. Now, that in some ways seems very positive, doesn't it? It seems to be a positive portrayal of women. The problem is, if you're not an angel, then you are a devil or a prostitute, okay? So, women had to fit into these 2 very tight categories. Either they were angels and wonderful and they gave their life up. In this poem, The Angel in the House by Coventry Patmore, the husband actually abuses and beats his wife, but she still loves him and puts up with all the abuse. And when he dies, she cries on his grave every day because she's such a dedicated woman. So the problem with this version of femalehood is that it is all about sacrifice, endurance, pain, and suffering. Think about The Mill on the Floss, okay, where Maggie falls in and Tess where they fall into this kind of state of despair, where they see it as the role of a woman to suffer and be unhappy. Okay? All good so far? Stop me if I need to. However, I'm going to suggest to you that the Victorian age was an age of absolute hypocrisy, and we're going to illustrate that by thinking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the famous story. Now, those of you who know the story will know that respectable Dr. Jekyll is a little bit bored with his life. Okay? A lot of people see Jekyll and Hyde as two different people. I'm going to suggest to you, I think it's a more technical story than that, and that Jekyll uses Hyde. How does Jekyll use Hyde? What does Hyde get up to? He beats people so his violence can come out. He has a little bit of nookie with some, woman who usually asks for a bit of payment afterwards. He likes drinking a lot and shouting, fighting and arguing. So in other words, Hyde is the unleashed dark side of Jekyll, is he not? In Freudian terms, Hyde is the repressed self, and the potion that Dr. Jekyll invents, which allows him to turn into Mr. Hyde, is a kind of release from the pressure of respectability. Now you can illustrate this in the following way, that Dr. Jekyll uses the front door, and the front door is really posh, etc., you'll see. And it has his gold nameplate on, Dr. Jekyll, you know what I mean, GP, he's got his scientific qualifications. So he represents order, he represents honesty, the public sphere, transparency, it's open to the public, and he's a professional man, a man of science, a man of rationality. Mr. Hyde builds his little pad at the back of the house. You have to go through a dirty little alleyway to get to it, and there's an old ruined door there. So what do you think that symbolizes, those two doors? Yeah, they're personalities. But also you can see it as being symbolic of the Victorian age. Because the Victorians loved prostitution. They loved it more than anything else. They reckon there were far more brothels in Victorian London than there are today, very interestingly. So the Victorians were supposedly very sexually puritanical. They even covered up chair legs so that men wouldn't get turned on if they saw the leg of a chair. They might sort of see a kind of curvedness and they might get all excited. As I said to you before, when buses first came out, there was a sense of terror that men might look up the stairs of a bus and catch a glimpse of a woman's ankle, and they would be inflamed with desire and unable to work for the rest of the day. So they were worried about these things, and yet they had prostitution. Child prostitution was rife. Human slavery was rife. They had kidnap gangs who kidnapped children and put them into compulsory human slavery and a sex trade. There was drug taking virtually everywhere. Many of you will know the story of Sherlock Holmes. Some of you will know that Sherlock Holmes is a hopeless junkie. Elementary, the American series today, they've kept the idea that Holmes is a junkie and he's in AA. Now, in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's book, the original Sherlock Holmes, if Holmes can't get a case, he starts to smoke opium and he starts to fall apart. So he's emotionally unsettled, emotionally unstable. The reason why Holmes is so effective as a detective is that he's friends with loads of street people, including kids who he uses. He's friends with loads of dodgy Chinamen. He knows the underworld. He has spies. He has connections to the dark side that is often hidden from the Victorians. So the Victorians were very worried, and they were aware of the underbelly of their culture. If you think of the most famous serial killer ever, what name comes to mind? Jack the Ripper, who is a late Victorian phenomenon, once again, okay? A man who cut out women's wombs, who behaved despicably and terrifyingly, and who used the conditions of England and London in particular at the time. I want you to think that London was a city of fogs, that there was very little lighting, there was very little policing. So how did that help Jack the Ripper? Absolutely. He had darkness, invisibility. He was able to prey and behave like a predator. So the Victorians were obsessed by crime, which is why the detective genre actually comes out of Victorian England. Firstly, through the writings of Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote about a detective called Dupin, and then later Sherlock Holmes, who becomes the greatest detective of all time. So the Victorians had a lot of anxiety about crime. As I said, there was a lot of fear in the Victorian age. Now, the Victorian age had a lot of great novelists like George Eliot and Charles Dickens, who were known for a kind of realism. But the books that actually outsold the realist books, the biggest selling books to the Victorians, were the Gothic fiction, without doubt. And in particular, Dickens' friend, Wilkie Collins, The Woman in White. You'll probably have heard of that, and you certainly would have heard of, say, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, wouldn't you? And you would have heard of Dracula. Okay, there were many Victorian Gothic books. In addition to that, they used to have these books called the Halfpenny Thrillers. So for like more working class people, there were lots and lots of books about serial killers, murderers, monsters, etc. Okay, and people were very, very interested in the dark side. The Victorians loved the Gothic architecture, didn't they? So they liked scary stuff. So I want you to see that there's this dark, imaginative, fantasy kind of side to the Victorians. And I'm going to be suggesting to you that at least some of this, this is very fantastic. This is my old professor, Stephen Marcus. You might want to write this down. He was one of the first historians. He's a revisionist historian. So that means he looks at normal history and he says, actually, we got it wrong. I'm going to show you that there was loads of hidden stuff. And you could tell from that photo, what do you think he's going to argue about the Victorians? Is she covered up in like a big dress and stuff like that? No, what he's going to show you is that there was huge pornography trade in the Victorian age. Like I said to you, all of the stuff about prostitution and child slavery, etc. And he actually says it's a very dark age, filled with all sorts of unspeakable stuff. So we need to go back and look at the Victorians and reappraise it and not take them at their official word. Now, why is that important as a historian to do you think? When you look at official documents, are they true? What do you think? Should we believe them? Or is it a sanitized, cleaned up version of the world? Well, of course it is. I mean, I've lived in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, two shockingly corrupt societies. Can't believe I'm recording myself saying this. But in highly religious societies, there's often a shocking underworld. And I won't go into too much detail, but I know in Kuwait very well, where drugs, prostitution, and wild parties, etc. are rife amongst people who are wealthy. Of course, that would never be the official version of the culture, would it? So I need you to understand the Victorian age is an age of appearance and reality. And all of this is going to be informed, in particular, by this guy. Who is he? Right, so he's Charles Darwin. We know he publishes in the 1850s. At first, this cartoon I've put up there, he was laughed at. Monkey Man, and there's quite often like pictures of him trying to make love to monkeys and things like that. You know, he's vilified and satirized because evolution at first is seen as absurd. But the more scientists write and show how compelling it is, the more Victorians begin to accept that evolution is probably the most rational and logical explanation for our existence and for what motivates human history. And behind that is the idea of survival of the fittest, which means what? So the original idea of mankind is that we're made in God's image, which means we're beautiful. We sinned and we were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and then we changed from being in God's beautiful image. But we still remained in God's image, didn't we? And the goal in life was to be good and to follow the example of Jesus. Darwin's turned that on his head. What's he saying the goal of life is? And if we're honest about that, that means if you're a man, beating the damn crap out of your rivals and sleeping with the girls. Doesn't it? Everyone looks a bit shocked. Well, let's just think about that. Isn't that the ultimate goal of survival then? Is to pass on your genes, to be the alpha male, to be the apex predator, isn't it? And indeed, what the Victorians began to realize was that mankind was a killer. And for those of you interested in this, there's a wonderful book called Sapiens, which I've read quite recently. And basically what it shows is we're smaller and weaker than any other form of man before us. We lived at the same time as Homo erectus, as Australopithecus man, as Neanderthal man. Every time they find Neanderthal skeletons, you know what they find? Smashed skulls. Who smashed the skulls? We did. Sapiens. Homo sapiens, the most violent, bloodthirsty, psychopathic creature the world has ever seen. We are responsible for the extinction of 98% of species in the world, including mammoths. Why are we weak? We think. So on average, Neanderthal and that, they were too thick to live together in large societies. They couldn't cooperate. Sapiens, they reckon, right from the start, would live together in societies of at least 3,000. We attacked en masse using tactics, weapons, tools, rocks, etc. We smashed. We absolutely stuffed them up. So, the Victorians were beginning to realize, and this is a famous quote from a Victorian poem, that nature is red in tooth and claw. Nature's not made by God. Nature is a nasty bloodbath. Do you guys think that's true? It's always interesting coming. You see, if you're British, you see little foxies, don't you? Little badgers and whatnot. But if, like me, you're South African, you watch a leopard killing something. It's nasty, isn't it? Africans can't have a nice idea of nature because we have cobras, we have mambas, we have lions, we have tigers. Hyenas kill old lions. I've watched that happen. Do you guys realize that? Far more hyenas kill lions than lions kill hyenas. As soon as a lion gets older, hyenas will track it, and 15 of them will eat it alive.
So have you ever been attacked by voodoo?
Never. I eat them. And I've shot many of them. Really? I would have shot that bugger. No, made biltong out of him. Anyway, why am I telling you all this? Because the Victorians are moving from a Christian pastoral idea of nature, you know, the romantic idea of nature, that nature is kind and beautiful and lovely, and we look at nature, and nature provides us with fruit, and God gave us nature, to the more Darwinian idea that nature is actually a battleground, and that we are part of that battle, and that we are no different from animals. Think about what Darwin did to people's minds when he said, actually, we're descended from apes. We're not built by God in God's image. We're descended from apes. There was this kind of sense of horror, a complete reappraisal. So I want you to think of the Victorian age as an age of shocks. Oh my God, we're descended from apes. Oh my God, there are these weird dinosaur bones. What the hell are they? Where's the Garden of Eden? What is a brontosaurus, etc.? This complete reappraisal of history. Arguably, the Victorian age is the age that faced up to scientific discovery more than any other age. And this, I think, is what creates the Gothic genre, the uncertainty, the fears. So by the late Victorian age, you've got religion being challenged. You have the birth of atomic theory. People realize they're atoms. You have the recognition of quantum physics, that we don't really understand maths like we used to. We have Sigmund Freud telling us that most of our mind is unconscious. So do you see that all the certainty disappears, and that's where you get modernism from. Modernism is the age that follows Victorianism, and that's where everything breaks up, and you start to get Picasso and all this weird experimentationism, Ulysses in literature, etc., etc., okay? But today I'm not talking about modernism. So I've talked about Jekyll and Hyde, and what I'm going to say to you, Jekyll and Hyde is, I think, it is the zeitgeist of the late Victorian age. Do you remember what zeitgeist means? Very important spirit of the age. Very good term to use, okay? German word, zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. I think Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is the zeitgeist, because what the Victorians begin to worry about is if we could come from apes, maybe we could go back to being apes. And maybe some of us who are a little bit hairy and a little bit squat and look a bit like monkeys, maybe you guys, because it's not me, look, I'm like, I'm all right. I look like a German. I'm one of the master race. Yeah, I'm okay. but some of you here need to worry because you may have a few monkey genes. And the Victorians began to worry that we had these monkey genes, and that's where criminals came from. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that now. If you look at Mr. Hyde, he is a short little guy. Now, you're okay. You're okay. Don't worry, I'm not insulting you. It became part of the kind of racist ideology of the empire as well. Can you see why that would happen? Why would that happen? Do you think? Why did it get mixed with ideas of racial superiority?
It's that idea of people sort of being less advanced.
And the need for Britain to be an empire. We were there not to rape and pillage from Africa and Asia. We were there to help the little buggers. Isn't that the idea that was there? And actually the most disgusting phrase the world has ever seen, in which Asia and Africa were referred to as the white man's burden. Have you ever heard of that before? That is a poem by Rudyard Kipling, where he actually says it is up... Yes, the guy who wrote the Jungle Book was a very enthusiastic imperialist as well. A fascist, essentially. And he argued that it was the duty of white people to save their lesser cousins. And whose theory do you think they're using all the time? Darwin. So this actually, if you trace it, is going to lead to Nazi ideology, to eugenics and ideas of racial superiority. And of course Hitler used ideas of Darwin in order to justify his idea of history, which is that the Nordic people, the blue-eyed blonde people, were the highest form of mankind. Interesting, because they were actually the scum of Europe that went around raping and pillaging and actually creating nothing. But there you go. Do you have to go? In the middle of our wonderful talk, though. Okay, I'm going to have to pause now because I'm so distressed. So just to remind you, there's an interesting connection then between imperialist ideology, the idea of white people's supremacy, which allows them then to go into Africa and Asia and to land grab and take resources and to dominate racially. There was the way that that was supported very often was with social Darwinist ideas of racial superiority, okay? And so that's very interesting, isn't it? You see how science has been misused and appropriated to justify colonialism. Right, now, very interesting is that towards the end of the Victorian era, this guy was one of the biggest selling writers. His name was Max Nodier. He was a Frenchman. He wrote an absolutely huge selling book called Degeneration, and it fits in with the themes that I've been talking about, the idea that what's going to happen is that we are going backwards as a species. The dark side of us is taking over. And this is a very useful term to learn, guys. My French pronunciation is terrible, so I apologize in advance. Fin de siècle, which means, in French, the end of the century. What it's come to mean, though, is the fear and anxiety that accompanies the end of the century, okay? And Nodier looked around him and he thought that London and Paris were corrupt. He saw a lot of world weariness and he saw a lot of decadence, bad morals. He saw the world in decline, like Donald Trump sees America today. You know what I mean? He calls it American carnage, doesn't he? You know what I mean? And when you listen to Trump, you think, oh God, the life's not worth living, we might as well kill ourselves because there's so many Mexican rapists in the world and drug dealers and etc., etc. Yeah. And only he and his weird right-wing neo-Nazi friends can help us out. Okay, so this guy, Max Nodier, is worth talking about. And he in particular, guess who he thinks are really in trouble? He's got two targets. One is all of these gay pufter men, okay, like Oscar Wilde. Here is a picture of Oscar Wilde, who was a famous playwright and poet. And there was the sense that men had become weak and arty and puffy, and they weren't tough anymore. And this was one example of degeneration. The other example of degeneration, of course, was the New Woman. There were too many weird feminist types who wanted to read books and get the vote. You know what I mean? And they were freaks of nature, and the, who does this sound like, eh? How history repeats itself, you know? Again, Trump, who seems to hate powerful women, doesn't he? So all of these weird women nowadays wanted to go to university and do weird things like wear trousers and read books and have opinions on politics. Of course, this was seen as absolutely disgusting and an example of the kind of corruption. So, people like Nadur and Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, didn't like the new woman either. So at the end of the Victorian age, you've got women rioting, I don't know if you guys realise this, for the vote. And they were called suffragettes. And conservative men looked at this and thought, these are freaks, like vampire women. Do you see? So it's not a big step to see the new woman as a kind of monster, as something against nature. And they were disgusted by things like, some of you may know that I do jiu-jitsu. I love jiu-jitsu. I believe that it is possibly the most feminist thing to do as well. And my daughter, I'll show you my little lovely daughter quickly. She is a jiu-jitsu champion. And there she is, okay? There she is competing in the world pros, okay? Now, one of the first people to do jiu-jitsu, fascinatingly, were the suffragettes. It came from Japan. And Japanese men were hired to teach suffragettes jiu-jitsu. Why do you think jiu-jitsu? Self-defense. And a small person can break a big person's arm. I've broken someone's arm before by a mistake. Because as soon as you use levers, etc., you break arms very quickly. You can choke people out. You can put people to sleep. 5-6 seconds, you can put someone out. Yeah. So it is an incredible martial art for self-defense, etc. This kind of behavior showed this new, disgusting, aggressive woman that was terrifying to the conservative Victorian man. Can you imagine that? Okay. Now, in Dracula, the extract that you're going to do with me, you're going to see that these freakish, horrible, really strong female vampires. And they're really scary, but they're also very attractive. So I want you to see that actually, at the same time, you can be really turned on and excited by something and disgusted and repulsed. Are they opposites? Or not? What do you think? Can you be repulsed and attracted? Of course. If you think about a lot of homophobia, men who hate gay men, very often are gay themselves, or latently gay. And that kind of anger, etc., may very well be seen by psychologists as a manifestation of their desire. You all looked a bit shocked, Matthew. No comment, yeah? So, I want you now to think about all of these different fears. Degeneration, gender changing, and there was one other I haven't mentioned, that I should have mentioned. Also, the fear of the pollution of the blood. Remember the story of Dracula? He comes from Transylvania, he's coming to England to suck blood and to contaminate our blood. When he sucks a woman's blood, she becomes an animal. In Dracula, Lucy, who's a lovely girl, gets sucked by Dracula and she becomes really sexy and horny all the time. And she starts being really bad. So there's this fear of blood pollution, of racial pollution. As London's becoming a more multicultural city, so the Brexit, Donald Trump types are more and more worried that there might be a little bit of foreign blood around, okay? So you see the intersection of all of these different anxieties, gender anxieties, okay, racial anxieties, imperial anxieties, monkey anxieties, the death of religion, uncertainty. All of this is the background to the Gothic. Interesting, eh? Right, and I'm going to end this long, rather dull lecture by just reminding you all of this stuff's wonderful, but it's only good if you can integrate it in. And that's what we're going to do now. Shall we do that?